113. Wow, I was actually calling Stella. Sorry, good morning. Hello. Please help me.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive. Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's Wood Cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive. Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics persist. The continent continues to export raw natural resources at low cost. Meanwhile, the resilience of its economies is tested by unemployment, poverty, and a global pandemic. Despite the challenges, together we can unlock this potential. At Arise IIP, our vision is to build an African industry. Our ambition is to shift Africa from a global commodity supplier to a global manufacturing powerhouse. We do this by identifying industrial gaps in African countries. We then design tailor-made infrastructure and solutions to enable the sustainable and local transformation of raw materials. In Gabon, where 85% of the land is covered by dense and pristine rainforest, we created from scratch a vibrant local timber industry. It did not happen overnight. We brought together local timber industry players and attracted foreign investors to create a competitive timber processing ecosystem. For this ecosystem to flourish, we attracted foreign investors, establishing linkages across the whole value chain, organizing trade shows for hosted companies to showcase and market their timber products, and boosting exports. GSE's wood cluster is now composed of 90 companies operating from the first to the third transformation of timber. All of them transforming ethically and sustainably sourced Gabonese wood. In less than 10 years, Gabon shifted from a net log exporter to the first exporter of veneer in Africa and second in the world. In fact, the real impact was much wider and more meaningful. With GSES, Arise IIP has created 16,000 jobs, attracted 120 investors coming from 18 different countries, operating in 19 industry sectors. In Togo, Benin, and Côte d'Ivoire, our work is underway, following the same approach. Cotton, cashew, soya, cocoa. We enable the transformation of local agricultural products with modern infrastructures and integrated logistics services. By investing in local manufacturing, we ultimately seek to replace foreign imports with domestic production. In all our endeavors, we are driven by the pursuit of green, sustainable growth, one that can last for generations to come. We are the pioneer of a green, responsible industrialization, one that ensures gender diversity, sustainability, traceability, and a zero-waste policy. This is why we create innovative solutions that support a climate-conscious economic development in Africa. This starts with neutralizing carbon emissions and creating a positive environmental legacy. By 2022, all of Arise IIP's industrial zones will be carbon neutral, powered fully by solar technology. This is all made possible by the dedication and commitment of the women and men who work at Arise. Together, we are on a journey to build an African industry, a journey to create a better, more resilient, sustainable, and inclusive future for everyone. Arise IIP, committed to making Africa thrive.
Dans ce contexte actuel de crise sanitaire mondiale liée à la pandémie de la COVID-19, il s'avère fondamental de relever la participation des femmes dans tous les maillons de la production, d'encourager et de renforcer leur leadership et leur résilience pour favoriser leur autonomisation, surtout dans le domaine économique. TechnoServe Bénin et l'Agence territoriale de développement agricole Pôle 4 s'inscrivent activement dans cette dynamique. À cet effet, le 15 et 16 octobre 2020, s'est tenue dans la salle de conférence de l'ATDA Pôle 4 à Parakou une cérémonie de célébration de la Journée internationale de la femme rurale édition 2020. Cette journée a pour objectif de définir les modalités de mise en œuvre d'une stratégie de renforcement du leadership et d'une résilience plus accrue des femmes dans les différentes activités de développement socio-économique.
Dans la plupart des décisions, ces femmes-là ne bénéficient pas des avantages qui sont liés au développement économique de chaque pays. Donc, pour les valoriser davantage, la communauté internationale a dédié la journée du 15 octobre pour les célébrer. Comme nous sommes en partenariat avec des projets, programmes, ils ont décidé de nous accompagner pour pouvoir célébrer l'événement au niveau local. Ces femmes-là sont aussi présentes surtout au niveau du maillon transformation. C'est pourquoi nous leur avons demandé de ne pas venir seulement pour écouter les discours, mais qu'elles viennent avec leur chef-d'œuvre pour qu'on puisse voir ce qu'elles font et les gens vont aussi profiter pour se ravitailler.
En effet, dans sa stratégie de renforcement des capacités des acteurs de la filière cajou, Technoserve, à travers Bénin Cajou, fournit des assistances techniques spécifiques et appropriées à la satisfaction des besoins des partenaires du public et du privé afin de promouvoir la production des noix brutes d'anacarde, le développement des chaînes de valeur et l'amélioration des revenus, notamment ceux des femmes.
Les braves femmes rurales sont effectivement à l'honneur aujourd'hui. Nous les félicitons et nous les exhortons à mettre leur résilience au service de nos communautés, surtout en cette période de pandémie. Et nous voulons les rassurer du soutien de Technoserve pour une plus grande intégration du genre dans les chaînes de valeur de la filière anacarde.
Rappelons qu'au cours de cette messe agricole et rurale de haute facture, diverses autorités ont accompagné la TDA et Technoserve à accélérer les meilleures innovations des produits dérivés du cajou et renforcer les aptitudes des femmes leaders et résilientes dans la filière cajou. Aussi faut-il le souligner, l'ambiance a été motivante et festive, marquée par 2 temps forts, portant notamment sur les réflexions et les partages d'expériences sur la résilience des femmes dans la chaîne de valeur anacarde et l'exposition vente des meilleures innovations réussies en faveur des femmes dans le développement socio-économique.
C'est grâce à Bénin Cajou que ça a été organisé dans le Nord, précisément à Parakou. Et ça a permis aux femmes des 2 Nord de participer. Je veux dire à Takora, Donga, Borgo, Albori, Zoukoline, du centre aussi. Voilà pourquoi je tiens à remercier très sincèrement Bénin Cajou. Et cette séance aujourd'hui nous permet, elle nous a permis de partager les expériences des autres femmes. C'est déjà un plus pour nous. Et pour nous qui sommes arrivés, je nous demande à notre retour de passer l'information à celles qui ne sont pas venues, pour qu'elles puissent aussi être informées de ce que nous sommes venus faire. C'est ce qui manque souvent. Et ça fait que les informations, nous les gardons, et les autres n'ont plus d'informations aussi. Ça ne permet pas un développement du groupe. Donc je nous demande de souvent communiquer, de partager l'information avec les autres femmes aussi de nos groupes.
Notons que dans la vision de travailler pour une véritable accélération et intégration de la filière cajou au Bénin, avec une part conséquente pour les femmes, l'intégration du genre constitue l'un des principaux axes d'intervention de Technoserve via le projet Bénin Cajou.
Le projet Bénin Cajou a inscrit dans ses priorités, à compter de l'année 2019, des activités pour la sensibilisation des acteurs en vue d'une meilleure prise en compte de l'intégration du genre dans les différents maillons de la production. C'est à ce titre qu'après avoir milité en amont par un plaidoyer auprès de la FENAPAB pour l'amendement des textes en faveur d'une plus grande intégration du genre, Bénin Cajou a soutenu en aval le processus de renouvellement des organes de gestion de la FENAPAB, qui s'est achevé le 23 septembre 2019 avec l'élection à sa tête d'une femme, Madame Saadatou Atta Kakayachi, en tant que présidente du conseil d'administration.
Après mon élection à la FENAPAB, les impressions sont bonnes. Surtout être à la tête d'une fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin. Les points clés de mes actions sont relatifs à la recherche des partenaires pour améliorer la qualité de nos activités, développer le plaidoyer à l'endroit de l'État pour qu'il nous accompagne.
Mariée et mère de 3 enfants, Madame Saadatou est propriétaire de 5 plantations d'anacardiers de 7 hectares et demi à Pénésoulou dans la commune de Bassila, à 372 km de Cotonou. Entrée dans la production du cajou depuis 1998 et précédemment chef quartier, cette mère dévouée gère en subsidiaire son restaurant, son commerce de savon et mène des œuvres sociales en faveur des orphelins de son arrondissement. Brave et vaillante, elle exhorte son équipe et les femmes dans la filière cajou à se battre pour pousser loin la filière.
Pour réussir ma mission, c'est un engagement efficace de l'équipe. Ensuite aussi, il y a la disponibilité, que toutes les femmes adhèrent aux coopératives de leur localité, entretenir bien les champs disponibles, celles qui n'en ont pas encore n'ont qu'à produire et surtout faire la vente groupée.
Le directeur général de la Fédération nationale des producteurs d'anacarde du Bénin, FENAPAB, explique ici les raisons qui ont soutenu cette action d'éclat manifestée par l'élection d'une femme à la présidence du conseil d'administration de la FENAPAB.
Depuis la création de la FENAPAB en 2006, elle a été gérée par les hommes. Déjà en septembre 2019, les hommes et les femmes ont souhaité mettre maintenant les femmes à la tête de cette organisation pour gérer ces deux organes-là, conseil d'administration et conseil de surveillance.
La commune de Basila n'est pas restée en marge de ce processus car la mairie s'est illustrée récemment dans des actes forts en faveur des femmes pour la filière cajou.
Il faut dire que c'est un honneur pour nous et une fierté de savoir que une dame de ma commune, à la personne de Madame Ata Kakayachi Sada, a été élue. C'est en même temps un défi pour nous.
Avec ce coup d'éclat, Madame Atta, présidente de la FENAPAB, élue pour 3 ans depuis le 23 septembre 2019, expose ici succinctement un plan de sa vision pour la filière cajou qui ne peut évidemment pas se réaliser sans le précieux concours des autorités en charge de l'agriculture au Bénin.
Actuellement, nous sommes à 130 000 tonnes. Mon souhait est qu'on fasse le double, sinon même pourquoi pas le triple du tonnage antérieur et ensuite qu'on puisse transformer plus de la moitié de ces produits au niveau local chez nous pour le plein essor de cette filière. Les activités à mener, c'est de continuer le plaidoyer envers le public, les privés, dans le renforcement des capacités.
Founded in 2006, the African Cashew Alliance (ACA) is an industry alliance for both African and international businesses interested in promoting a globally competitive African cashew industry. It is a member-based organization whose members represent all aspects of the cashew value chain, including producers, processors, traders, and international buyers. At the African Cashew Alliance, our vision is to have a sustainable African cashew industry that delivers globally competitive value-added products and secures profitability for all. On a bigger scale, our mission is to create a platform for accelerating growth and investments in the African cashew industry through partnerships, advocacy, market linkages, technical support, and global networking. The African Cashew Alliance seeks to achieve its vision based on pertinent 4 pillars, which are to 1. Facilitate networking among members and offer timely information on the cashew sector. 2. Advocate for sector improvement and partnerships. 3. Facilitate food safety standards. And 4. Increase processing in Africa through investment promotion and technical support services. Are you considering exploring the cashew industry or already a stakeholder? The African Cashew Alliance invites you to become a member today. Membership at ACA provides diverse benefits including access to profiles of other ACA members for business-to-business and networking, an extensive database for cashew stakeholders, discounted conference and event fees, discounted technical assistance and business advisory packages, electronic newsletters, quarterly reports and analysis on the cashew sector, and many other benefits. We also offer services in line with having a sustainable African cashew industry. These include market information system, quality and sustainability seal, technical assistance to processes, investment support, and access to finance. The Global Market Encounter GME with Jim Fitzpatrick is an iForum brought to you by the African Cashew Alliance, ACA. GME provides a unique platform for diverse stakeholders to challenge assumptions and learn while discarding information that is obvious to be false, separating facts from fiction, and providing an accurate and timely market update are the core mandates of the GME. The GME is a free bi-weekly webinar that takes place on Wednesdays at 9 a.m. GMT and brings together participants from both the private and public sectors, ensuring that a unique perspective is brought on board. The Cashew Master Training Program, MTP, is a tailored cashew training which consists of 3 one-week classroom and practical sessions that provide a facilitated platform for exchange, with the goal of creating a pool of technical and managerial expertise and facilitating regional exchange among cashew experts by sharing lessons learned and innovations at the regional and national levels. The Cashew MTP is designed for a sustainable industry. Trained experts in each country become resource persons for knowledge transfer in several areas, including agronomy and cashew orchard management, post-harvest management and cashew product quality, processing and value addition to cashew and its byproducts, market mechanism, nut and kernel market analysis, business relationships among stakeholders, value chain development, assistance with self-financing, among others. After 16 editions, the ACA Annual Cashew Conference and Expo has become the iconic cashew event in Africa and beyond. The ACA conference offers a one-of-a-kind opportunity for African and international cashew industry stakeholders to come together and discuss industry challenges and opportunities, find solutions, construct and refresh partnerships to build a sustainable and competitive cashew industry. Several African cashew producing countries have hosted the ACA Annual Cashew Conference, notably Mozambique, Tanzania, Côte d'Ivoire, Gambia, Benin, Ghana, Guinea-Bissau, Tanzania, and Nigeria. For the 17th edition in 2023, the conference will be hosted by Senegal from the 18th to the 21st of September in the famous and vibrant city of Dakar. The ACA conference features plenary sessions by experts from all sectors of the cashew industry, thematic forums, numerous business-to-business meetings, World Cashew Expo, and a variety of networking and social events. All roads
Good morning to you all, and good afternoon for those in other time zones. It's a pleasure to be back.
Recording in progress.
Again, and welcome to this edition of the Global Markets Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Today I have as my co-moderator, Stella Bangre, and she will be doing this with me. Before we continue, let me also acknowledge our sponsors and the other partners who have made this possible. So we have USDA, MoveCom Cashew, SNI, Intersnack, Pro Cashew, Prosper Cashew, Benin Cashew, CMA, CGMA, and also Arise GDIZ. And thank you all for being with us all throughout this. Before I go to Jim, a bit of housekeeping. We are coming to you in English with simultaneous translation into French. And so we have the button for you to select the language that is appropriate for you. And we also have the Q&A feature, which you can use to drop in your questions, and then we will address them. But you also can raise your hand, use the raise hand feature, and then we will come to you and ask you the questions and to get Jim to address them. Again, please know that we are live on Zoom, Facebook, and YouTube. And again, let me also say that at the end of Jim's session, there will be a Q&A session, which will not be recorded. So beginning from this session, all the Q&A sessions will not be recorded. We are only recording them the start of the session as I have now, up to the point where Jim is done. And then that will be available for those who want to have further reference to the discussions here. But the Q&As will not be recorded so that people can feel free to ask whatever questions they have. So without taking much of the time, I will at this moment invite Mr. Jim Fitzpatrick. Hi, Jim, how are you?
I'm good, Ernest. How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. It was nice having you in Lagos last week. Pleasure to have you take us through the policy environment globally and also in Africa, and then also to facilitate all the dynamics in policy development and the other aspects which you did excellently last week. So it's a pleasure to hear from you again. And please, you have the floor.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. It's good to be with you again, and you're very welcome. Let me share my screen. As Ernest was saying, we were talking a lot about cashew policy and the success and failures of cashew policy last week in a good session in Lagos, and I was lucky enough to be in Accra the previous week. Also talking about policy and policy developments on cashews. But first of all, let me get back to my first choice of subject, which is always the market. And today we're going to talk about the markets as we always do. And we're going to bring a bit of a focus on West Africa, on some of the developments in West Africa, particularly on short-term market developments. And then later on, we're going to tackle some of the things that we see as the big questions for the West African cashew industry, which are, of course, also global questions for the cashew sector. But let's start having a look at the markets, and let's see what we think is happening, what we think might be happening in the coming weeks. So we'll have a look at the kernel situation first. Prices relatively stable, led by Vietnam as usual. Prices are relatively stable, occasionally drifting down a little bit. Not too much business going on, but I think perhaps there's a little bit more business going on than meets the eye. If we look at the big picture, which has had an influence on the kernels market, you know, in the past when we saw recession or prospect of recession, we often used to say that that was good news for snacks, good news for cashews. It hasn't turned out that way this time. But now we see that inflation is past its peak in the US, according to the Federal Reserve. In Europe, the fears of recession are disappearing. We see that the IMF is saying that it's unlikely that the European Union will go into recession. So the economic outlook starts to become a little bit more positive in those countries in the West, which are, after all, major buyers of cashew kernels. However, imports remain sluggish, particularly in the United States. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But we have seen strengthening demand in Asia, particularly China and Japan, and also in the Middle East. This is a short-term positive factor. In the longer term, we will need to see demand recover, particularly in the United States. If we look at the whole decision-making process on cashew kernels, there is a bit of a mismatch at the moment with supermarkets' decision-making processes. The opportunity for promotion is there because cashew kernels are at some of the lowest prices we have seen. But there is certainly, right across the spectrum of edible nuts, has been and continues to be a reluctance on the part of major retailers to lower prices across all of the nuts. This has been a repeated point of frustration for producers of not only cashews, but also products like almonds, walnuts, and pistachios. And you can see that particularly if you look at some of the conferences in the United States and some of the chat around why retailers haven't been reducing prices and the impact of that on growers. And cashews, of course, is no exception. It probably takes a little bit longer to impact cashews. So whereas it was impacting products like walnuts last October, November, it's been hitting cashews in the last 2 or 3 months, at least at the farm gate. So what are those prices? And still we have this situation where we cannot say there is simply a 320 price. And this is something which has become more and more clear over the period of the pandemic and in the last 6 months. And that is that we have to take note of the wide range of prices of cashew kernels. So you get the basic low-end price in Vietnam now around $2.55, but you also get the opposite end of the spectrum, the domestic price in India, which is way up there and has been for a long time. And we focus in on Africa and we look at prices, for example, high quality BRC factory selling forward, delivering to known clients, versus a factory that might be at the lower end of the spectrum, looking for clients on a daily basis rather than developing longer term relationships. And from the African cashew exporter's point of view, this difference between being in the top end price range, this price range around the 280, 290 mark at the moment, and the lower end of the range, which tries to compete or has to compete with low prices from Vietnam, either on the quality BRC level, the AFI level, or the lower quality level. The difference, and therefore this gap in pricing, is often simply about marketing. Whether you've sold forward, whether you offer the right certification, whether you market well, whether you market for export, or whether you sell to someone else who does the export for you. These are often huge factors in determining that gap in price, and it is quite a gap. The lower end of this is $2.55 for 320s. The higher end is around $2.90. So what you sell, where you sell, but most importantly, how you sell it has a huge bearing on the kind of prices and therefore the profitability of the processing business. And that's becoming more and more clear for African cashew processors. What are the impacts of these trends? Well, let's have a look at the origin. And what we see is that farm gate prices in most countries are still under pressure. When I say under pressure, I mean downward pressure. There is a struggle to maintain pricing. The RCN trade has slowed down a little bit, as you would expect, as prices are now tending to stabilize at these lower levels. Prices have dropped off quite a bit since the beginning of the season. If you look at the early season offers, they may not have been trades, but the early season offers and today's offers, you could be looking, depending on the country, at as much as 25% drop off in prices, which is hugely significant, of course. If we look at the impact of these trends on regulation, and we've mentioned on this webinar many times that the level of regulation and government engagement in the sector has increased hugely in the last 15 years. We're now seeing in some cases something of a crisis of regulation. So if we look in Benin, we see that. If we look in Guinea-Bissau, Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire, we see challenges and also lessons for the market and lessons for regulators in these trends. And of course, it's important that we look at those. And that was one of the things we were doing last week in Lagos with a group of regulators and policymakers from right across West Africa, was to look at some of these challenges and some of the lessons from the current trends. The difficulty, or one of the key difficulties, is the enforcement or support for minimum pricing regimes. And this is not an easy task because, as we know, cashew is a pretty volatile commodity, short-term and long-term, and it's quite difficult to calculate, present, engage stakeholders in this kind of regime. And then you get to a situation like now where the market forces, for one reason or another, not all of them clear, not all of them legitimate either. Well, when we look at it, governments are dealing with what is a very difficult situation and trying to deliver on their promises. The regulatory bodies trying to deliver on the promises of government to have a minimum price.
Yeah, it's on, but
But market forces often pulling against that, particularly in countries where processing volumes are very low. So let's have a quick look then at the cost and freight prices on raw cashew nuts. We have a situation where prices have dropped off, as I mentioned, significantly in the course of this season. Now that's happening usually at this time of year anyway. That is something that takes place. The reasons in the current environment, as always, quality drops off, so price drops off. No surprise there. Look in Ghana, for example, look in Cote d'Ivoire, and you'll see reasons for that. But also the current kernels market is not doing us any favors in terms of the value of raw cashew nuts. And then there are currency factors in play too, and they can pull either way. They can pull prices up or down. But there's one thing about markets and currency markets, and there's one thing about our cashew business which has a kind of a speculative culture, and that is that if people expect currency change, they tend to defer decision making if the currency change is going to be in their favor. So if people, for example, were expecting the Indian rupee to strengthen, they might delay purchasing decisions until that comes about, depending on their situation. For some, they can buy and then wait. For others, they need to do the currency transaction at the same time, or at least to make the calculation at the same time. If we look at this RCN situation in the longer term perspective, so here we're looking at raw cashew nut prices from 2015 all the way through to this week, in fact, the 19th that was, we see that prices are relatively low. So we're looking at prices now that are just above the lows of the early days of the pandemic. Now, if we think about that period, that was a period of panic. It was not at all clear at one moment whether or not the trade could continue to take place. It was not at all clear that the nuts would be indeed harvested, never mind shipped. And we got this dip well below the typical expectations for that period. Now, when we look at that and we look at now, it's very difficult to make logic of it. So we've got the index. I've mentioned to you before, we calculate an index. So this is the red dotted line. And this is the cost and freight RCN price index. And that's based on an average of what is available at any given moment in the market. So we calculate it, or we actually record it weekly and calculate it monthly. And what it does is it gives us a broad indication of the value of raw cashew nuts at any given period. So for example, you'll see that it spikes up in October, November because availability is less and because the quality of the raw nuts available at that time from Tanzania, for example, are of high quality. During the West African season, we have a range of qualities, a range of outturns, and quite a volatile market. So at that time of year, the index is usually relatively stable. But what we're seeing here is that prices have hit surprising lows. But if we look at the kernels market, maybe we're going to get some clues on that. And I will come back to that in a little bit. But first of all, let's have a look at the trends in the trade of raw cashew nuts over the last 4.5 months. So looking at our situation this year, if we look and compare to previous years, these are Vietnam trade update imports. So this is the cumulative import of raw cashew nuts into Vietnam for the period. So by the 15th of May, Vietnam had imported just over 900,000 tons of raw cashew nuts from all origins. And that is quite a bit ahead of 2022, as you can see. I haven't included 2021. I never do in this kind of analysis, simply because we know that the 2021 figures were wildly distorted. And therefore, they don't make good material for analysis and comparison. Looking at this situation, what we're seeing is that throughout this year, January, February, March, April, and May, the improvement or the increase in imports of raw cashew nuts into Vietnam has increased each month. So now it is, for the 4.5 months up to the 15th of May, it's 7.4% higher than it was in 2022. And as you can see, it's miles ahead of where it was in 2020 or 2019. So there is significant raw cashew nut import trade going on. The Vietnamese buyers continue to buy. Despite that, prices have been falling. Let's have a look then at their balance sheet in Vietnam. So the balance sheet is an effort to calculate exactly what kind of inventory would be available in Vietnam, which is a guideline, and this is only a guideline, to their needs for RCN, for Vietnamese processors' needs of RCN in the coming months. So let's have a look. And the best way to do this usually is to make a comparison, because the absolute numbers may be distorted, as we know. So let's have a look at the comparison. So if we look at the blue bars, this is 2022 figures. And we know these are reasonably accurate because we had a full year and we could work backwards from the final statistics. What we see is we have the total imports from Cambodia, the crop estimate in Vietnam, the total exports of kernels converted into RCN, domestic consumption, import of unpeeled, carry-in, which is based on estimates from our good friends in Vietnam, then a calculated inventory, and finally a carry-out. What was the carry-out at the end of the year? What stock was in hand? And when you look at the situation comparing this year to last year, we come out to the conclusion that due to strong exports, also matched by strong imports, a relatively small decline in the Vietnamese crop itself, but mostly due to a lower opening transit stock. We see that the carry-out is less than it would have been this time last year. So this is forecast over the year. And when we look at that, we see that there's about 78 days of processing stock available. So how do you get to that? You take imports plus the crop plus the inventories at the end of the year, the carry-in, plus the transit stock, and you reduce domestic consumption and exports from that. How many tons are used a month? It's around about 190,000 tons is processed every month in Vietnam to give these export figures. Dividing that by the inventory, you get about 78 days processing. Now, there are some caveats around that. First of all, what is the quality of the transit stock? Is it still low quality material? Would the outturn therefore be less, which means you would need more material in stock? And that remains to be seen, and there's no way to know that. But we can suspect that it probably is lower quality stock that would be left at this stage. There's no dramatic conclusion from this other than to say that it is quite likely that Vietnamese processors will need to continue to buy. So long as their export trade holds up, they will need to continue to buy raw cashew nuts, and that they will be likely to enter the market fairly soon again, that the prospect of a long-term absence from the market is not really possible. Of course, we have to factor in too the influence of international traders who may well have their own ideas as to where prices should be and their own ideas of opportunities in the market. Let's have a look at the Indian situation on imports, and here we see a slightly different way of presenting it. So we're just looking at imports here. This is the cumulative monthly imports. So each month is the total imports to that period, and we're looking at that compared to the previous year. So what we're seeing here is that although April was relatively similar to last year, the January and February figures were far lower than last year, and therefore there's a little bit of perhaps catching up to do. Now, there are a number of reasons for that. First of all, we know that in the second half of last year, there was a huge increase in the imports into India. The all-time record was almost double the previous record. We know that Benin has been absent from the market in terms of shipments in the early part of the year, although they wouldn't probably have arrived yet in India in the situation last year. But we would expect good interest for Benin market RCN, and we would expect to see that in the figures in June. And the other factor has been the prognosis, the trading, the speculation, whatever way you want to describe it, in the Indian rupee and its relationship with the dollar. So in a time of relatively slow kernels demand in India, in a time of expectations on the Indian rupee, it's not at all surprising that we would see imports slightly behind. Now, when we say slightly behind last year, we're saying it's slightly behind a huge all-time record. When we compare it to 2020 or 2021, it's pretty much on target. So it seems to me, after 4 months, that it's unlikely that we will see the huge import figure of last year repeated for India, but it's quite likely that we will see figures similar to 2021 or 2020. Now, having said that, no one, up to the end of maybe June, July, no one would have expected last year that India would import the kind of volumes that it did. So we need to keep a close eye on that. What does this mean for the famous parity calculation that so many people talk about? What does it mean for the conversion and the cost of conversion? So we take a calculation based on the current value of raw cashew nuts, and we take some assumptions on processing costs. So you can see there the assumptions that I've taken. $200 a ton for African raw nuts processed in Vietnam, $350 in India. For larger processors in West Africa, $450, and Mozambique $500, although that isn't relevant at this moment in time. So those are the processing levels, and what we're trying to do here is to make a comparison between the cost of processing and the current market. And as we know, we have been in a period where that match has been poor and processors have struggled to make money. So when we look at it now, we see a calculation. So this is Vietnamese processing of local raw cashew nuts or Cambodian raw cashew nuts. And the cost is higher because the price of those was higher. But that season is just about over, and most of those raw nuts are processed by now. If we take the case of processing in Vietnam of Ivorian raw cashew nuts, we end up at a lower cost. Now compare that to the cost of processing Ivorian raw cashew nuts in Côte d'Ivoire in a large factory with a processing cost of around $450 a ton. And I've taken a 45 pounds outturn so that we're talking about what might be currently available in the market. So you end up with 5 different cost prices on 320s. Now, obviously this is not exact. It's different for every factory. It can be different for different markets depending on things like breakage, depending on the quality of the raw cashew nuts purchased, and a whole range of other factors. But if we take consistent factors across the different quality product and the different processing areas, we should get a reasonable comparison. So let's look at those 5 and compare them to the market price. So this blue line is the WW320 FOB Vietnam price at the lower end of the range right now. You're around the 255, 260 price range. And this is the price in India. Again, a kind of an average price in the domestic market, which always trades higher for well-known reasons. And what we're seeing now for really the first time this year is that if you buy Ivorian raw cashew nuts around these prices, $1,030, $1,040 cost and freight, around the 47, 48 pounds, it works. You can make it. This is not a sufficient margin, but it is a margin. And it makes money. If you process in Côte d'Ivoire and you're efficient and you can market and all of those other things that we always talk about in relation to effective and profitable processing, the margin starts to look quite attractive. So the suggestion from this is that because of the lower raw cashew nut prices and because kernels prices have remained relatively stable, that we are getting toward a level of what's often called parity. In other words, that the raw cashew nut price allows processors to buy, process, export, and make a profit. And we are getting toward that. It's better than it has been for some time because the raw cashew nut price has gone down. Now, I thought for a long time that it was more likely that the price of the kernels would go up. That hasn't happened. It's remained relatively static. It may happen later this year. Usually if we see movements in kernels price that aren't related to a crop failure, we see them in the second half of the year. So let's wait and see. I should mention the Indian situation. India has been generally in a better situation throughout. If you buy domestic raw cashew nuts in India, and prices this year are much lower for domestic raw cashew nuts in India, or if you buy, I took Benin as the example as the most popular raw cashew nut for processors in India, and compare it to the local market, which is protected by import tariffs, as we mentioned the last time. If you were with us, you'll recall we talked about the level of import tariff protecting the Indian market and essentially keeping out lower cost imports from Vietnam. And that's done as part of government policy to protect jobs and to protect the industry. So it looks as if there is a calculation in India. People tell me that maybe demand isn't as good as they expected, but nonetheless, there is quite a decent calculation there, and also for Ivorian raw nuts. And that would also apply, I think, for Nigerian, Guinea-Bissau raw cashew nuts based on the current market price. Again, it's different for each factory, but we have to try and make some generalizations in order to draw a broad picture of where we're going. So we'll have a look at the exports from Vietnam. So Vietnam being the main supplier to international markets, Vietnam is supplying about 89% of the US market and somewhere in the region of 75% of European imports. Between those two, we're looking at about 40% of world demand. So it's really important to look at Vietnamese cashew kernels exports. So what I do is I look at the 4 months. So in January and February, so 2023 is the red bar, 2022 is the orange, 21, 20, and 2019. The first thing that jumps out is January wasn't a great month. January exports from Vietnam were well down, and that's well documented and much talked about in Vietnam. February, we saw something of a recovery. So really, I think what we were looking at over January and February is a balancing of one was down, one was up. If you look at the two together, actually the start to the year wasn't that bad. If we look then at the subsequent months, and let's take a look. Let's take a look at March and April. So March, now it's starting to look quite positive, and we go into April and we see again quite positive numbers. So we're seeing March and April exports starting to grow much better. Now, if we look at 2022 or even 2021 compared to April 2023, it doesn't look that dramatic. But I'd ask you to think back 5 years and look at this dramatic change from 2019. Compare that to that. It is really quite remarkable. So the last time that we saw 3 months in a row where this kind of increase in exports was back in 2020. Now at that time, a lot of those exports were done early in the year because buyers were fearful that there would be a huge disruption due to the pandemic, and they therefore decided, let's get stuff shipped early. There is no such factor now. In fact, imports have been quite low. They've been quite subdued. So what's going on? This is not an easy one to work out. Fact, however, and the first fact is that up to April 2023, record exports from Vietnam. Something that's strangely never mentioned. Everyone's talking about the problems and the difficulties. This factor is overlooked. So let's move on and have a look again at the total situation from Vietnam over the period. So we're seeing exports even above the 2021 levels, which was the biggest year in history. We're seeing an increase of about 5.5%, it's actually 5.6% above 2022 for January to April. But it is a whopping 29% over the figure of just 5 years ago. So lest we become despondent about the future of cashew demand in a short-term demand squeeze or a period of slow demand, we should cast our eyes back over 5 years and look and see how much demand has grown by over that period. If we look right back to 2017, exports from Vietnam, now it's not demand obviously, but it is a huge indicator of world demand. Demand has grown by a compound annual growth rate of 10%. That is remarkable. Through the pandemic, after a period of very high prices, we still see this growth. So long term, well, medium term, I suppose, if we're talking 5 years, there is a very strong demand trend, and that adds to a longer term demand trend that's been there for many, many years. But that's not much help if you've got some product in the warehouse and you can't sell it, or you want to sell it, or you're not happy with the price you can get for it. So let's have a look at the very short-term factors. So what I did was, again, I looked at the situation in Vietnam. Again, our real indicator of demand outside of India. Now, India is a huge market, about 40% of world demand. But outside of that, we can look at Vietnam for trends. So, okay, this confirms. So you have the percentage increase or decrease from last year for the selected destinations. So what I do is, now we're looking at shipments here, by the way, we're not looking at imports. I will come to imports, but we're looking at shipments right now. So I looked at USA and Canada shipments from Vietnam, according to the Vietnamese Customs Service, 14% down to the end of April. I took four major European countries, the four major European countries for imports, the Netherlands, Germany, Italy, and the UK, down by 10% to the end of April. Looking for better news, now bear in mind these are percentage changes, so the UAE and Saudi does not buy anything like the volume that Europe or the United States buys, but we're looking here for indicators. So shipments to the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia combined in the period were up by 59%. Shipments to China, and this is interesting, were up by 66%, meaning that the recovery from the restrictions imposed during the pandemic is almost complete. Japan, a much smaller market, but an interesting market and indicative of where the East Asian market might go, up 36%, and Australia down by 23% following a very strong performance last year. So you could draw some conclusions from this very mixed picture. So first of all, we should not conclude that the improved Vietnamese exports over the year will continue. Right now, over the first 4 months, it has been driven by improved exports to markets like China, like Saudi Arabia, like Japan. But given that the US and Canada takes about a quarter of Vietnamese exports and Europe takes about 22% of Vietnamese exports, if this situation continues, then we will not see, over the longer period of the year, we will not see as healthy a position on exports from Vietnam. We could also look at this and think about why is it that the Western countries, Australia, and we could conclude, given that we are seeing changes at the consumer level in terms of confidence, in terms of buying, that it looks like that those areas that have so-called modern retail, that is where more than 80% of the food is sold through supermarkets, they have still got a lot of catching up to do despite lower prices. And this goes back to the point I made earlier about a mismatch between supermarkets' buying patterns and habits, their lack of flexibility, and the fact that at low prices we see no impact. This is quite an interesting factor. So right now we can say that UAE, China compensate for lower exports to North America and the European Union, but that of course will not continue because these big markets will wipe out the increases. We're looking at percentages here, remember. So this increase in exports may not continue unless we see some more action from North America and possibly from Europe. Let's have a look then at those markets. So having a look at US imports. So we are seeing a rather slow recovery. So what have we got here? So we have US monthly imports of cashew kernels, a comparison in tons over the months January, February, March, April, and May 2019 up to 2023. So in other words, this light gray here is the imports during January 2019. The red one is the imports during January 2023. And what we see is that imports in the first quarter are down by 24.4%. That is significant. That is a huge number. If I take a little liberty with the figures, so if I look at the shipments from Vietnam that have already taken place to the United States, and if I extrapolate from that, suggesting that those will continue to represent about 89% of the imports, this is what we would get as forecasts
Then when I
for
went there,
April and May. So it looks as if the
I
downtrend
do
continues into April. And then when we get into May, because there has been an increase in shipments, as we get into May, it starts to recover a little bit. Now, this would be just simply based on what has already happened in terms of shipments. This has nothing to do with whether or not American buyers come in for more product, whether they buy forward, none of that. This is all about what's already happened. So on this, it would see that there might be some recovery by May, but that overall imports would still be down by 18% for the first 5 months of the year by the time we get to the end of May. Now, we won't have those April statistics until later this month, hopefully, and we won't have the May statistics, obviously, until we get into June. So we need to make some kind of a forecast, and a good way to do that is use the numbers we have, which are numbers from customs services in Brazil and India, Vietnam in particular. So there's no real suggestion that there's a short-term reversal in demand in the United States, but there is good reason to believe that the tide is beginning to turn. Let's focus in on African trade, African cashew kernels trade with the United States. And for the first quarter of the year, this is all African countries. I didn't want to present a too complex picture, so I put all African countries together rather than looking at individual countries. And if we look at this, what we're seeing is that the share has increased to 9.4%. That's pretty healthy by comparison. It's nowhere near enough, of course, but it's pretty healthy by comparison. That imports from African countries have held up relatively well compared to imports from other countries. I mentioned earlier, overall imports in the first quarter down by 24.4%. African imports are down, but they're only down by about 6%. So there is something there. Now, there's also an element that we should understand, and that is that a lot of processors also have, West African cashew processors also have their own warehousing and units in the United States. So companies like Olam, Uzibras, and others have their own warehousing facilities. So there may be an element. There's no way to know, for example, whether or not this product has been sold in the United States market. We just know it's been shipped there. So let's just have a look then at the market share over the last 5 or 6 periods. So I went back to 2018. I went back to 2018 because I wanted to see that there was a kind of a steady 7% share pre-pandemic, and there was. So this is a share of US imports for African cashew kernels in the year 2018, 19, and so on. Now that dipped in 2020 and 21, reduced processing in West Africa due to the pandemic, and hugely increased imports into the United States. So obviously if the size of the market goes up and your shipments don't go up, your market share goes down. So there was a dip, but that's come back strongly. And now in the first quarter of 2023, we're seeing the highest ever market share for African kernels in the United States. Certainly of the modern era. It might have been higher in the 1970s based on East Africa, but of the modern era, 9.4%. That is pretty good progress. Having said that, the actual volumes remain relatively low. Now, whether or not that will continue throughout the year remains to be seen. If, for example, we get an increase and a return to normal trends in US imports, will that 9.4% be maintained? Probably not. But it does look as if the overall increase is likely to continue. Next time we might look at the European situation. European statistics by their nature, 28 countries, 27 countries indeed, come out a little bit more slowly. So next time we'll have some European figures and we look at African countries' share in the European market and the trend on that. If you recall, last year it hit 10%. And I think when we look at it, we're going to find that it's higher this year. So that's an overview of the market. I said we would focus on West Africa, and I said we would look at some of the major questions facing the sector. So this, in the second half of our discussion this morning, I'm going to focus much more on the broad issues, policy issues in particular countries. So there is short-term problems in the market, and we know that there are a lot of issues around right now, and that we know there are a lot of challenges around. So I thought we'd just take a quick look through these. So looking in Vietnam, we see that the parity is returning for African raw cashew nuts. We know that production is probably down this year in Vietnam. Now, it's not a huge factor because Vietnam is a relatively modest producer of raw cashew nuts compared to Cambodia, India, or Cote d'Ivoire. But the product crop was down, and there is a certain amount of parity returning now, as we saw earlier. The Cambodian crop estimate, now I'm getting a little bit puzzled on this one, because what I'm seeing is Cambodian officials, Cambodian traders telling me that the crop is a good one, it's a big one, but the actual trade into Vietnam suggests something slightly different. The actual trade into Vietnam might suggest that the crop is a bit smaller than that. Now, some people say that farmers and merchants are holding on to inventory of raw cashew nuts. I hope not, because if they are storing it wet. That's been the habit in Cambodia, and that means that the quality will decline. So I'm concerned that actually the Cambodian crop is a little bit lower than was expected. If we look in India, again, the good crop forecast, prices, local prices in rupees for raw cashew nuts are lower than they were previously. That means that at least for the next 2 to 3 months, processors that buy local raw nuts will have plenty of options in terms of their sourcing. If we look at Nigeria, definitely a better crop than last year, whether it's 250, 270, you can pick a number because there isn't really a definitive suggestion on what the number is. And, you know, we know it's not the 500,000 tons that's been put in some media outlets. We know that it's probably in this 270, 300,000 ton range at the most. There's also the complication this year of material flowing in from Benin, which I'll come to a little bit later. Looking in Cote d'Ivoire, again, low prices at the farm gate. That's not news, that's been there for a few weeks. The CCI has introduced a program to try and support farm gate prices or to enforce the regulation, which makes sense. But to my mind, and this is only based on commentary from people around the country, I suspect the crop is a little bit lower than the initial forecasts. I don't think we're going to see 1 million tons or close to it in the country this year, which is down to weather, it's down to circumstances. And I think there's also probably to be considered is that some of the material might be of lower quality. Now that could be, in the early stages, it could have been mixing in of some old crop. That was definitely going on. But it does appear that as the season has gone on, some of the quality has declined a little bit, and probably the volume has declined a little bit too. Benin, really difficult situation. I'm going to come back to Benin in a moment. High minimum price, low trading price. It should be an opportunity for processors. We'll come back to that. Guinea-Bissau looks like good crop. Farm gate prices are still low-ish compared to the minimum price. There's been certain volatility in setting the taxes and the fiscal regime for this year, which I think is resolved now. And there's been a few problems around freight in terms of the cost of freight, different lines with different prices. And that makes trade difficult. You don't know what the price of the freight is going to be. It's very difficult to do some business. And in Senegal, we have the crop started, same in the Gambia, actually pretty high raw cashew nut prices to begin with, that they might need to be moderated as the days go on. So there's a quick picture of the highlights in West Africa. Let's look at some of the big questions now. First question, and you may have seen this in the news media, a strong El Nino event is predicted. What does that mean for cashews? So I had a look at the Red Cross Red Crescent Climate Change Center, which is very interesting. There's a lot of sources on these, but I found that one very accessible, and I borrowed their maps, which are published and available to everyone. What it looks like is that if there is a strong El Nino, that it could mean hot and dry weather during flowering in Southeast Asia and South India. And later, particularly for, let's say, the northern half of India, it could mean very hot and dry weather. So it can impact the monsoon, which may not have an immediate effect on cashew nuts, but could in the longer term have an impact both on supply and on demand. So El Nino is something to take notice of. I had a look at previous El Nino events, and I just did, as traders do, I looked at what was the influence of previous El Nino events on the market. Now, I want to say we cannot draw an absolute correlation between the two things. It's an indication, it's a thought, but we can't say because of El Nino prices went high. What we can say, if we go back to two major El Nino events, 97, 98, and 2015-16, they were followed by poor crops. In 1998, a poor crop in India, I think it was 98 and 99, a poor crop in India, and prices headed up toward $3.50, which, by the way, at that time was a huge price. I remember paying prices above $3.50 and wondering, was I crazy at that time? It looks much more reasonable price today. Then we look at 15-16 and we see again, although it's less clear where the crop problem was then. We know there was a shorter crop in Vietnam. We know in the early part of the season that a lot of Vietnamese buyers were really concerned about the crop, and they really started buying, and that caught fire, and Colonel's buyers followed, and the market went to these dizzying heights. I think it went to $5.25 FOB for 320s at one point, although there wasn't an awful lot of business done. And the rise was followed by a crash. So I think that given a number of factors here, given that we're looking at prices at lows that we haven't seen since 2009, given that there is a chance of a strong El Nino, given that the impact of that is in important growing areas for cashews, we need to take note of this, and that needs to be followed. So that is a significant question arising in 2023. Coming back to Benin, and coming back to some of these issues that we have been discussing on policy and sector development, with projects like Pro Cashew, Benin Cashew, and others, the impact of policy and selection of policy by governments in the cashew sector. So here's a chart that shows the forecast production in Benin, orange bars, and the forecast processing capacity, assuming that the new zone is moderately successful. Not that it will build 80,000 tons of processing in a year, as some salesmen there told us when we were there in August, but that it will be relatively successful. And what you see is the yellow area. The yellow area is the shortfall of capacity of processing compared to production. What does that mean? Well, first of all, if you ban the export of raw cashew nuts, that does not help that gap. Your processing capacity does not match the production, and that asks big questions. So managing the transition to 100% domestic processing is not easy. It needs clear and careful attention and planning. There is a potential in banning exports before the processing capacity is ready, and indeed after it too, that there will be losses for farmers. So, secondly, adding processors in a centralized area outside the growing area may well be an attractive quick fix for processing in the country. But doing so when you have local processors who are not yet up to their capacity may well mean that the net effect is much limited. So you add processing, but you also lose existing processing. You lose established, effective, profitable units by substituting them with new units away from the growing area. So it's the strategy of the policy is an essential consideration. Second idea of a processor's buying window. Well, not a bad idea, in my opinion, can work, well thought. But first of all, we have to ask, are the processors in a position to pay the price that they need to pay to secure the raw material? CFA 375, I think, is the minimum price. I may be corrected on that. And secondly, do they have the working capital to buy within the window? So if we think about a buying window, we also have to think about what is the financing mechanism in the sector for processors, and what is their profitability, what are their costs, and what is the cashew kernels market. So to do this transitional arrangement at a time when kernels prices are low, RCN prices are only catching up right now, asks a lot of questions. And I was reading recently that processors are buying, but that they still have some way to go. And it looks to me as if further mechanisms are needed to support that, even with some of the large processing companies which are multinationals. If we look at the zone, the GDIZ, I think, and this is very much a personal opinion, so don't get riled at African Cashew Alliance, this is Jim's opinion. I think that conferring a large amount of market power, purchasing power on a single organization can cause market chaos. And I think it can cause disillusionment among stakeholders, particularly farmers, their representative organizations, and existing processors, particularly those that would be niche players, that would have heavy investment, that would be leaders in technology. So this idea of allowing one group to purchase everything might look like a neat solution, but actually it may not work. It may well ultimately cause the existing sector to be undermined. It may well ultimately, and it could easily, scare the hell out of a lot of the investors who are now looking at the sector and how it's operating and their place in it and wondering, what have I got myself into here? Fourth aspect, so we've created this tension in the market. So the tension is that either during the window or in the future during the ban, that there's more product available than processors can absorb. That's always going to happen in a move toward processing based on policy, based on an export ban. That's kind of, you could say, a price you have to pay. Maybe it is. But what happens to the raw material? Well, it heads for the border. So it heads for Nigeria, as I mentioned, it heads for Togo, as it did last year. So in this buying vacuum, if the processors don't have the money or can't pay the price, the RCN must go somewhere. And it heads for the border. Now, I know that that's been, to a certain extent, stopped in Benin because export buyers are buying now and the market is working. My point about all of this is that when we make policies that involve grand changes, it's very important to consider the impact, the domino effect, how one thing affects another, and how that might long-term undermine stakeholder confidence and engagement in the sector. So we need a realistic approach. I'm full of admiration for what's going on in Benin and the efforts that have been made to revolutionize the sector there. I think it is absolutely superb. But we do need to look at how it's managed and the transitional arrangements impacting that. Let's have a look at another issue. So right now we're looking at almost every West African country that has a minimum price regime. The market, one way and another, is trading below that market price, and regulators are struggling to enforce market prices. So when we look at this, we've got really a problem, and I think largely the problem is of resources. I think regulatory bodies struggle with the resources they're given. So you give them a difficult task and then you under-resource them to do it. For me, it's a question of looking at setting minimum prices. I think it can be done. I think it can be done effectively, but it probably needs a little bit of flexibility and it needs resources. What does it need? It needs good market information. It needs that regulators, stakeholders understand what this market information needs. It means that they understand the impact of decision-making in certain aspects. It needs enough time to set the price. It needs a database so that there's reference information back and forward. It needs an understanding of the impacts. So a lot of this is about analyzing your sector. What are our competitive advantages? What is our quality? Where do we fit in the market? How do our processors operate? And what's the impact of setting minimum prices? What's the cost of production for our farmers? So minimum prices should protect farmers from market volatility. But in my opinion, they can only do so if there's a certain amount of flexibility. So for example, the idea that we can change the market price, the minimum price during the season, either up or down, to make sure the product moves. It's far, far more damaging for a farm family if they don't sell their product than if they sell it at a slightly lower price. And that's a balance. I think in order to achieve that balance, what's really important is to take submissions from stakeholders. Farmers, farmer groups, processors, exporters, aggregators, traders, and so on, NGOs, support organizations. There's plenty of them out there, and I don't think that somehow listening to them would do anything other than improve the minimum price setting. When you look at situations, you look at the price set in Ghana this year, set in December. At the time, it looked really good. It looked like a really good calculation. It made lots of sense. And into the early part of the season, it still made lots of sense. So it was well chosen. But as the year's gone on, the market's dropped way, way below that price. So I think setting a market prices, minimum market prices, which seem to be here to stay, is a big challenge. And how that's done is a big question for the sector in West Africa. Choosing policies, and I was in Ghana a couple of weeks back and I spoke to some really interesting people, and there's great things going on in Ghana in cashew, and I think the future is bright. But I think also that the selection of policies and the mechanisms around them need to be very, very carefully looked at. And I think in Ghana, the TCDA and others are doing so. Key factors, and these are factors that I myself was looking at while I was in Ghana. What are the competitive advantages of the sector? Quality, timing, for example. Good business environment, perhaps. Logistics. Challenges, preserving the quality and the level of production. So Ghana will reach a much higher level of production in due course. It's probably around 200,000 tons now, according to good, reliable local figures, and it will reach 300,000 tons by the looks of it. But as we know, there's huge transit trade through Ghana. This year, probably the crop will be exported and processed, and then the same again volume will be exported. Already, I think exports are around 170,000 tons by the end of April. We have production in border areas. So we have these raw nuts flowing into Ghana. The black arrows are sort of legal trade from landlocked countries. The red arrows are trade from maybe smuggling are on borders which shouldn't have that trade. Although I noticed that my Nigeria-Benin arrow might be reversed in 2023. So borders are man-made, and either side of the border there are cashew trees and cashew farms. So that's one aspect. And those nuts may come into Ghana, they may go the other side into Cote d'Ivoire, for example. But there's also road trade, legal, normal, expected road trade down from Burkina, Mali, and so on, down to the ports of Ghana for export. And there is trade which from the Ivorian side is seen as illegal, the export of cashew nuts by road. From Ghanaian side, it's not illegal. And you see, this has to be managed. So, for example, at this time of year, we're in the second half of May, the product that's being traded in Ghana is probably largely not grown in Ghana. So these are areas that, when we look at policy, there's a lot of management factors to be taken into account. Managing what I'm calling it the transit trade, for want of a better word. Managing the border area production, where product grown on the other side of the border might normally flow into Ghana. In other circumstances, it might normally flow into Cote d'Ivoire, but we have export taxes which frustrate that and change prices between the countries. And finally, as everywhere, the problems or the ideas of supporting value addition. When we look at the selection of policy, it needs to be linked to the competitive advantages, the various strains on the market. And this is a big question, not only for countries that are developing policy in cashews, Ghana is one, perhaps Nigeria is another, but in countries that have already established policies to make sure that those policies remain relevant and effective in the years to come. Another example, Tanzania. So recently we've seen the 29th of April in the Guardian newspaper, I picked up an article that said Tanzania will no longer export unprocessed cashew nuts. That means that the auction, the raw cashew nut trade will come to an end. It said that there will be 4 large factories built and there was a budget of 10 billion Tanzanian shillings to do that. Fabulous ambition. 2025-26. Is it realistic? Is this ambition realistic? Is it possible to do this? Is this an unrealistic policy? So thinking about it, I thought, yeah, for sure, change is needed. Tanzania should be a major processor, and I think will be a major processor in years to come. But it's very unlikely that enough processing capacity could be built in time. You would need 250,000, maybe 300,000 tons processing capacity if you get a good crop by that time. Nowhere near that in place at present. The budget suggested to build 4 large factories is entirely inadequate. I don't exactly know where the number comes from, but that ain't going to work. It could be a misreport in the newspaper, of course. What will happen to the rest of the crop? Again, similar to the Benin situation. If you don't have enough processing capacity, where does the rest of the raw cashew nuts go? If the export of raw cashew nuts is illegal, or has been stopped or restricted, or it's at such a level of export taxation that it just doesn't make any competitive market sense, what happens? Again, it would cause, in those circumstances, farm gate prices for raw cashew nuts to crash. And we are seeing indications of that in other countries. So it just underlines for me, the key failure, or one of the key failures in policy. And if you get a chance to read some of the studies done by the Pro Cashew Project, you'll see one of the key failures in policy is setting unrealistic goals. So the risk is when you set an unrealistic goal that all the focus becomes on that goal. All the regulators, all the resources, all the sector becomes focused on that goal to the detriment of other activities. And that is a prospect with this announcement from Tanzania. I wouldn't be surprised if we saw moderation or some kind of transitional arrangements brought in. Managing production growth. So what we're seeing, or what we have seen, is production has shifted to Africa. The two big processing countries, Vietnam and India, have essentially failed to increase their production. The trends there are flat to falling. I think Vietnam is falling. India growth is about 1.5% per annum. That will improve in India, but not hugely. We look at Cambodia. So you have the growth in 2021 to 1 million tons or somewhere in that range. Inputs, seedlings, the weather, low prices, lack of value addition in the country, a surge in growing of other crops, fruit in particular. And now farmers are being asked, given the circumstances, you planted these trees when cashews were at all-time high prices. You're selling the cashews in 2023 at some of the lowest prices you've ever sold them at. Would you continue to grow cashews? So managing that kind of growth, managing whether or not farmers will continue, remains to be seen. It seems unlikely that people will cut down trees that they've planted only 5 or 6 years ago, but that has happened. And it tends to happen early when they can replant and correct the situation from their own point of view. Second question in this is, will Africa increase production enough to meet demand in the future? And that's determined by prices, but also by infrastructure, inputs and training, origin processing, and of course, climate change. We know that Brazil is unlikely to recover. So if we're looking at meeting demand in the future, increasing demand, we're looking at Africa, especially West Africa, and we're looking at maintaining what's happened in Cambodia. Increasing in Cambodia seems unlikely, but maintaining is the challenge. How to support value addition? Big question. We saw transitions in the past, in the 1970s from East Africa to India, in the 1990s from India to Vietnam, at least for the export trade. Are we now going to see this switch back to West Africa? And the market is full of regulation, full of situations. I mean, would the Indian cashew processing sector survive if it wasn't for import tariffs on cashew kernels? It probably would. It would be different. It would probably be mechanized. It would look a lot different, a lot fewer jobs in it. But it would definitely be subject to huge imports from Vietnam. Absolutely no doubt about that. The big question is, looking at the situation, if Vietnamese processors were to lose money as they have been for the last year, Indian processors continue to be protected. Can African processors use their competitive advantages, particularly vis-a-vis this market in Europe and this market in North America, between them 40% of world demand? Can African processors use their competitive advantages to make that work? That is the big question in terms of processing. If we look at consumers, we would never have been asking questions about cashew consumption up until these last few years. So big questions would be India, huge growth in consumption in recent years. Will Indian growth price African processing out of the market? What do I mean by that? Will Indian cashew processors and consumers be able to pay such prices that African processors will not be able to compete? Now, that did happen in the past. It's not really there just now, but it could return in the future. Second question, can these growth levels return in 2023 and be maintained? How has price volatility impacted consumer beliefs? I mean, I had a little, earlier this morning, I was chatting about the reluctance of supermarkets to reduce prices on edible nuts to increase demand. And I was a little bit critical of them. But when it comes to cashews, they have also had to manage huge volatility over the years. Roasters, packers, supermarkets have had to manage huge volatility too. And, they've seen in 2017 prices head up toward $5 a pound, in 2018 back towards $3. The highest price, high or low, is not the factor. The price volatility is a huge influence. And that's something that needs to be managed and to be addressed. Is sustainability the factor that we thought it might be? I think we can be pretty certain that food safety is as strong a factor as it was expected to be. But is sustainability likely to persist as such a huge factor? We have seen consumers, according to retail surveys, we have seen consumers' interest in Europe, for example, here in my country, for example, we have seen consumers' interest in sustainability wane this year as their concern for value for money and worries about inflation have kicked in. So there are questions now about demand and how we manage demand and how we sustain this growth. So just a moment ago, I talked about, can African processors build their markets in their obvious directions, which are Europe, the United States, and of course the domestic market. Can Chinese demand continue to grow? Now, we've seen, apart from the interruption of the pandemic and the zero COVID policy in China, we've seen huge growth in imports. Will that continue? Is there a taste amongst Chinese consumers for cashew nuts in the same way that they have a taste for walnuts, almonds, and other tree nuts? And in sub-Saharan Africa, what can local consumption, how can local consumption influence the overall supply and demand picture? It could be critical for the development of value addition, the development of employment, and eventually the enhanced value addition. So if you have an opportunity to sell value-added products within your own domestic market, that will encourage you to do the same in export markets. So now questions around consumption that have not really been there in the past 20 years, where the growth, steady growth, was assumed in North America. It probably outperformed our expectations. Steady growth was assumed in Europe, again, outperformed our expectations, mainly on consumers' choices in terms of what was a healthy food. And questions that persist and have been there for a long time. I was looking at something recently, a report on the retail market in West Africa for cashew kernels, but it was dated 2007. And when I looked at it, I thought very little has actually changed. Key markets, India, potentially China, and we need to consider that. So there are question marks around consumption that we need to look at. What's on the horizon? Again, how will we in the West African cashew sector, I say we, not as a participant, but as a supporter, how will they cope with these trends? The rationalization of processing in Vietnam, which is happening right now. More and more direct buying. More and more situations where successful factories take over unsuccessful factories and add to their capacity. The production slowdown in Cambodia. So it's gone to its peak. It's started to drift back again. What's the next move? So we've seen the impact of the introduction of about 650,000 additional tons of production in a very short space of time. That's not going to continue. What's the next step in terms of what happens in Cambodia, which is one of the most interesting cashew countries around, but also the impact of what happens in Cambodia on the rest of the world. And we'll see things like processing recovery in Tanzania, and hopefully we'll see more and more cost efficiency in African cashew processing units. I mentioned the price I'm using, $450 a ton for cost of processing. I know there are some that are significantly below that. More that get below that, the better. It makes the sector more and more competitive. But how to do that is a big question. And managing these factors is also a major question looking to the future. getting towards the end, final thing I'm going to talk about this morning is sustainability. So we know that the African cashew sector has an advantage in sustainability. But is sustainability a key factor? How important is it? Or are we just looking at greenwashing here? So if we look at the RCN trade, we know that it's necessary right now. And we know that it gives value, it gives outlets, it gives income to farmers right across African countries and elsewhere. But it certainly does not, cannot, will not meet sustainability goals by any measure of those. Secondly, we know that growing and processing at origin is likely to be more sustainable. We know there's research. Most recently, I've seen research from the Cashew move suggesting that processing at origin is significantly more sustainable than moving the product right across the world to process it. But the question is, and we'd, up to this year, I probably wouldn't have asked this question, but I'm certainly asking it now. Are the buyers and retailers really serious about sustainability? This is a key factor. When it comes down to price, it looks like in 2022, the vote was, well, let's not worry about sustainability, let's worry about price. Now, maybe that's just a short-term factor, but it is a factor, and it's something that needs to be considered. Secondly, what will be the impact of climate change? We know that more areas will become suitable for growing cashews and less suitable for growing other crops. That research shows that. We know that the onset of climate change, according to the scientists, is faster than expected. How will that impact this industry? Is this industry an opportunity to mitigate the risk and to mitigate the impact of climate change? That's a huge question for the cashew sector today and into the future. And finally, I'm including in sustainability working practices. And the picture you see there is an old picture, but I think it's probably representative of practices in some factories still today. So the question is, are the working practices in our cashew processing plants and outsourcing units, and I stress that outsourcing units, operating within the requirements of buyers? Now, I've been through a lot of factories in West Africa in recent years, and I've seen almost all of them I could answer, yes, they are. But then again, you're not often taken to the factories where those factors wouldn't be in place. So do we check? Do we audit? Do we want to know? And over the years, going back many, many years, going back 30 years even, listening to people talking about these issues. Back in those days, it was mostly in India, and there were some excellent examples of factories with good practice. There were probably some examples of poor practice too. But the policy of many buyers at that time was, well, look, better not to know about it, better to avoid this issue, because it can only cause us problems. But we can't do that. You cannot ignore this issue for all of the reasons around labor practice, people's human rights, the treatment of human beings, but also for the simple reason that your buyers won't allow you to get away with it anymore. And this is a huge question for cashew processing in some countries, and one that we cannot afford to ignore. So looking at it, we ask the question, is the cashew sector in a fit state to sustain growth and to manage the volatility that it's facing? The market has seen this unprecedented growth. We ask the questions, is the market aligned with customer needs? The old phrase, know your customer. Can production rise to meet expanding demand? If it does, and this is maybe even a bigger problem than the production rise, If the production rises to meet the expanding demand, can the infrastructure cope? So if we move 2 million tons now, what happens when we're moving 3 or 4 million tons in the years to come? Will the infrastructure be able to cope? Or will we see undried, poor quality cashews wasted every year? Can the industry continue to offer improvement in incomes for growers? If we don't, it'll act as a disincentive to production, particularly in face of climate change. And this is a key factor. So what we've seen in recent years, in places where people have choices, they've often reduced their cashew production. Look at Vietnam over the last 15 years. Look at the upsurge and then the backtracking in Cambodia over the last 2 or 3 years. Now, a lot of growers don't have choice, but many do. And if we want to incentivize production, we have to offer a way out of low incomes for cashew producers. And going back to the final question, is this industry sustainable in the time of climate change? So there are a lot of big questions being asked in the cashew sector. And as always, when it becomes difficult and when there's a little bit of a struggle, people ask these questions. When everything gets better, during the booms, we tend not to ask these questions. We just concentrate on our work. But I think now we really do need to look at these. All right, so looking back at the market and what's the outlook for the coming weeks, in my opinion, I think that we are going to continue to see the production estimates for the 2023 crop moderated. The crop will be a little bit lower than originally expected. I don't think that creates any supply-demand crisis at all, but I think it is a fact. I think we will see defaults on raw cashew nut contracts. The market's come down a long way. A lot of processors will say that they're not able to afford to pay for their contracts. There'll be quality complaints, things that unfortunately we're very familiar with. Secondly, what actions will be taken to protect minimum pricing? Will it be turn a blind eye or will it be take action? We'll have to see how that works out. That can have long-term impacts on the production trend. This is without doubt an opportunity for West African cashew processors. Prices are relatively low. Premium prices are available for African cashew kernels of good quality, certified African cashew kernels of good quality. It's not so good for farmers. Obviously, these lower prices don't work as well for farmers. And that brings us back to the discussion on minimum pricing. I think that short term, without being pessimistic, I don't think in the immediate short term there's a prospect of any huge turn in demand in the USA and in Europe. It will happen. It will happen in 2023, in my opinion, but I think it's going to take some time. We will see more buying, but I think buyers have been rewarded for conservative strategy with lower prices, and I think they will continue that. But keep an eye out for promotions, keep an eye out for a change in that approach, and then we might see a pickup in demand. 2024, my guess is a different story. We get back to strong demand growth. India, big question again on demand. How will Indian demand behave? Will we see the same levels of demand as last year? It has been a little bit slow after a huge pickup post-pandemic. What's the next step for Indian demand? So there you have it, a discussion of the market. When I sat down to put together this week's thoughts, I thought there wasn't an awful lot to talk about. But there's always a lot to talk about in cashews. And when it comes down to it, when you get into difficult times, it starts to pose these major questions. And answering them in difficult times is the biggest challenge. So I'll pass you back to ACA, to Ernest, and thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's always a pleasure to have you and also to hear you present the market and also clarify things the way they are. I have a number of questions here. I think they all
Recording stopped.
They all deal with the presentation you have made. Also, as you just noticed, we've taken off the recording, and we invite of your questions. So the first one has to do with the RCN prices, India, Vietnam, I guess, where now you're talking about the RCN prices falling. And then the questioner wants to know what factors, because according to him, you need to clarify what factors are contributing to the fall in the prices. I think earlier on you had mentioned that the fall in 2020 was due to COVID and the misinformation at the initial period. But then now what factors again are contributing to this decline in prices? So I think I'll pause here and then I'll come with the next ones.
Well, the factors I mentioned were first of all, the kernels market. That's obviously a huge factor. Secondly, when we look at imports during 2022, India had enormous imports in 2022 and therefore obviously had quite a stock of product. I understand most of that is moved now. Expectations on currency and foreign exchange. And I think the movement of price, and price has fallen significantly. I'm not saying, by the way, that it's going to fall further. I think price is relatively stable and workable at the moment. But what I am saying is that this market, as often happens, it probably just started at too high a price this year. And therefore we've seen prices fall. Therefore we see some high price contracts done. Therefore we probably see some defaults ahead. My guess is now that you will see, as the quality declines, and quality does decline in West Africa as the season goes on, it declines more when the season is slow or late, or shipments are slow or late, because the infrastructure is not there to protect the quality of the product. So obviously lower quality product gets a lower price. So there's a number of factors at play. Kernels market, perception of poor demand, although shipments have stayed quite strong for kernels, the expectations on the currency, and of course this decline in quality. Now, it may be that crops turn out to be a little bit less than initially expected, but I do not think that that will have a noticeable impact on prices per se, because quality factors are overriding that. Ernest.
Thank you very much, Jim. I saw this one coming. The question is on 2021 figures were widely distorted. I think this is a statement from you, that 2021 figures were widely distorted and that you're not going to consider them in one of your charts. The question is, distorted by what? Can you explain further?
But there is no categorical explanation as to why that happened. We do know that the imports, the figures that were distorted were the imports from Cambodia into Vietnam. Now, why do we say that they're distorted? Well, we look at the import figure and then we try to figure out, where did that product go by the end of the year? Was that volume of product produced? And we come to the conclusion that many people have come to, by the way, is that the import figures during February, March, and perhaps April of 2021, trade from Cambodia into Vietnam was overstated. Now, it's overstated for a number of reasons. It would appear that people had reason to declare imports that actually didn't happen. So I can't give you a categorical reason why.